Sarah Martinez walked through the military base cafeteria with her head held high, despite the whispers that followed her everywhere. The burn scars that covered the left side of her face and neck were impossible to hide, no matter how she styled her hair or adjusted her collar. She had learned to live with the stares and comments over the past 3 years. At 32, Sarah worked as a civilian contractor for the Army's logistics department. Her job involved coordinating supply deliveries and managing inventory for the base. She was excellent at her work, known for her attention to detail and ability to solve problems quickly. However, her appearance often overshadowed her professional achievements. The scars were a reminder of a house fire that had changed her life forever. She had been trying to save her elderly neighbor when a beam collapsed, trapping her under burning debris. The neighbor survived, but Sarah paid the price, with severe burns that required multiple surgeries and months of recovery. The physical healing was difficult, but the emotional scars proved even harder to overcome. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Sarah arrived at her office early, reviewed the day's delivery schedules, and prepared reports for the weekly logistics meeting. She took pride in her work and had never missed a deadline or made a significant error. Her colleagues respected her professionalism, even if some struggled to look past her appearance. Around noon, Sarah headed to the cafeteria for lunch. She typically ate alone, preferring to avoid the social dynamics that her presence sometimes created. As she carried her tray to an empty table near the window, she noticed a group of new military trainees at a nearby table. They were young, probably fresh out of basic training, full of energy and confidence. The base regularly received new personnel for advanced training programs. These soldiers were usually eager to prove themselves and sometimes acted without thinking. Sarah had seen this pattern many times before. Young recruits often felt the need to establish their place in the military hierarchy through displays of bravado. As Sarah sat down and opened her sandwich, she became aware that the trainees were looking in her direction. Their conversation had grown quieter, but she could sense their attention. She had developed a sixth sense about these situations over the years. Sometimes people stared out of curiosity, sometimes out of pity, and occasionally out of something less kind. One of the trainees, a tall young man with short blonde hair, seemed to be the leader of the group. He kept glancing at Sarah and making comments to his friends that made them snicker. Sarah tried to focus on her food and ignore them, but their behavior was becoming increasingly obvious. The cafeteria was busy with the lunch rush, filled with military personnel and civilian workers. Most people minded their own business, but Sarah could feel the tension building at the trainees' table. She had experienced situations like this before and knew they rarely ended well. Despite her best efforts to remain invisible, Sarah found herself becoming the center of unwanted attention. The young trainee's comments grew louder, and his friend's laughter became more pronounced. Other people in the cafeteria began to notice the disturbance. Sarah considered leaving, but she refused to let others dictate her actions. She had as much right to eat in the cafeteria as anyone else. She had worked hard to build a life for herself after the accident, and she would not be driven away by the thoughtless behavior of others. The moment she had been dreading finally arrived when the trainee stood up from his table and began walking toward her. The young trainee approached Sarah's table with a smirk on his face, his friends watching from their seats with anticipation. His name tag read Jackson, and he moved with the overconfident swagger typical of someone trying to impress others at someone else's expense. "Hey there," Jackson said, stopping directly in front of Sarah's table. "I couldn't help but notice you from across the room. My buddies and I were just wondering what happened to your face. Did you stick it too close to a campfire, the cafeteria?" Seemed to grow quieter around them. Several people at nearby tables turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she kept her voice steady when she responded. "I'm trying to eat my lunch in peace," Sarah said calmly, not looking up from her food. "Please return to your table." Jackson laughed loudly, clearly enjoying the attention he was receiving from both his friends and the growing audience of onlookers. "Come on, don't be so sensitive, I'm just curious. Did someone throw acid on you? Or maybe you were in some kind of industrial accident. You look like a monster from a horror movie." His friends erupted in laughter from their table, encouraging his cruel behavior. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had endured worse comments than these over the years, but they never stopped hurting. "That's enough," Sarah said firmly, finally looking up to meet Jackson's eyes. "You need to leave me alone now." But Jackson was just getting started. The attention from his peers and the other cafeteria patrons seemed to fuel his cruelty. "I'm just saying, maybe you should consider eating somewhere else. People are trying to enjoy their meals, and looking at you kind of kills the appetite." "You know?" A woman at a nearby table gasped audibly at his words. Several other people looked uncomfortable with the situation, but no one seemed willing to intervene. Sarah realized she was on her own, as she had been so many times before. "Listen here, Freddy Krueger," Jackson continued, referencing the scarred horror movie character. "This is a military base, not a freak show. Maybe you should consider finding work somewhere that customers don't have to look at you. I bet even the supply closet would be too public for someone like you." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her sandwich. The pain in Jackson's words cut deeper than any physical wound she had ever experienced. She thought about the months of physical therapy, the painful surgeries, the nights spent crying into her pillow wondering if she would ever feel normal again. "You don't know anything about me," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible above the cafeteria noise. "I know enough," Jackson replied with a cruel grin. "I know you're probably the ugliest person I've ever seen. I know that looking at you makes me want to lose my lunch. And I know that someone like you has no business being around decent people." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Even Jackson's friends seemed to realize he had gone too far. The entire cafeteria appeared to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah stood up slowly from her table, her dignity intact despite the tears that were now freely flowing down her cheeks. She gathered her things with as much composure as she could manage, preparing to leave the cafeteria and find somewhere private to cry. Just as she was about to walk away, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the silence from across the cafeteria. The voice belonged to someone with unmistakable military bearing and commanded immediate attention from everyone in the room. "Trainee Jackson," the voice called out sternly. "Step away from that table immediately." Jackson spun around to see who had spoken, his face suddenly draining of color as he recognized the figure approaching them. General Robert Hayes strode across the cafeteria with the kind of presence that made everyone in the room stand a little straighter. At 55 years old, he was a decorated veteran with over 30 years of military service. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his posture commanding, and his expression showed barely controlled anger. Jackson's face went pale as he recognized the 3 stars on the general's uniform. This was not just any officer, but one of the highest-ranking officials on the base. His friends at the nearby table immediately stood at attention, their earlier amusement replaced by obvious fear. "Sir, I was just," Jackson began, but General Hayes cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Silence," the general commanded. "You will not speak unless I give you permission to do so. Is that clear, trainee?" "Yes, sir," Jackson replied weakly, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. The entire cafeteria had gone completely silent. Everyone understood they were witnessing something significant, though most had no idea what was really happening. Sarah remained standing by her table, confused by the general's sudden intervention, but grateful that someone had finally stepped in. General Hayes walked past Jackson without giving him another glance and approached Sarah directly. His stern expression softened completely when he looked at her, replaced by something that looked almost like reverence. "Ms. Sarah Martinez," he said gently, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "It's an honor to see you again." Sarah looked, confused, studying the general's face carefully. She didn't immediately recognize him, though something about his eyes seemed familiar. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't think we've met before." "We haven't been formally introduced," General Hayes replied with a slight smile. "But I know exactly who you are. You probably don't remember me, but I was Lieutenant Colonel Hayes 3 years ago when I visited the hospital after your accident." Understanding began to dawn on Sarah's face. During her recovery, several military officials had visited the hospital, but she had been heavily medicated and focused on her physical therapy. The visits were mostly a blur of uniforms and formal conversations. "You see," General Hayes continued, speaking loudly enough for everyone in the cafeteria to hear, "Ms. Martinez here is not just any civilian contractor. She is one of the bravest people I have ever encountered." Jackson stood frozen in place, beginning to realize that he had made a terrible mistake. His friends remained at attention, watching the scene unfold with growing horror. General Hayes turned to address the entire cafeteria, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing large groups of people. 3 years ago, this woman risked her life to save an elderly civilian from a house fire. She entered a burning building not once but 3 times to ensure that everyone inside was safely evacuated. Murmurs of amazement began to ripple through the crowd. People who had been watching the confrontation with mild interest were now paying complete attention to the general's words. On her final trip into the building, the general continued, the structure began to collapse. Ms. Martinez was trapped under burning debris for over 20 minutes before firefighters could reach her. The injuries she sustained while performing this heroic act nearly cost her life. Sarah felt her cheeks burning again, but this time from embarrassment at the public attention rather than from cruel words. She had never considered herself a hero and was uncomfortable being described as one. The elderly woman she saved was Mrs. Eleanor Washington, General Hayes announced. Mrs. Washington happened to be the grandmother of Staff Sergeant Michael Washington, who was serving overseas at the time. Staff Sergeant Washington was my aide-de-camp, and Mrs. Washington was like a grandmother to me as well. The connection was becoming clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't just a random act of kindness that the general had heard about. This was personal. When I learned what Ms. Martinez had sacrificed to save Mrs. Washington's life, I made it my business to ensure she received the best possible medical care and that she would have a place in our organization when she recovered. Jackson's face had gone from pale to completely white. He was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake and the person he had just insulted and humiliated. General Hayes turned his attention back to Jackson, his expression returning to the stern, authoritative look that had commanded the cafeteria's silence. The young trainee stood frozen, realizing that his cruel words had been directed at someone the general clearly held in the highest regard. "Trainee Jackson," the general said coldly, "you have just insulted and humiliated a woman who demonstrated more courage in a single day than most people show in their entire lives. Would you care to explain your behavior?" Jackson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. He looked desperately at his friends for support, but they were all staring at the floor, wanting no part of his predicament. "I asked you a question, soldier," General Hayes repeated, his voice growing even more stern. "Sir, I didn't know," Jackson stammered. I was wrong, sir, I'm sorry." "You didn't know?" the general repeated incredulously. "You didn't know that making fun of someone's appearance is wrong? You didn't know that treating a fellow human being with cruelty and disrespect goes against everything we stand for in the military?" Sarah watched the exchange with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated that someone was finally standing up for her, but another part felt uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. She had spent 3 years trying to blend into the background, and now she was the center of attention for the entire base cafeteria. General Hayes continued his address to the room, ensuring that everyone present understood the full significance of what had just occurred. "Ms. Martinez doesn't just work here because I felt sorry for her. She works here because she is exceptionally good at her job. Her performance reviews are outstanding, her attention to detail is unmatched, and her dedication to this organization is absolute." He gestured toward Sarah, who stood quietly beside her table, still processing everything that was happening. "The scars you see are not marks of weakness or something to be mocked. They are badges of honor, proof of someone who was willing to sacrifice everything to save another person's life." The general's voice grew softer as he continued. "Mrs. Washington lived for 2 more years after the fire, long enough to see her grandson return safely from deployment. She spent those years telling everyone who would listen about the angel who saved her life. She never knew Ms. Martinez's name, but she never forgot her face or her sacrifice. Tears began to form in the eyes of several people in the cafeteria. The story was having a profound impact on everyone present, transforming their understanding of the quiet woman they saw every day, but never really noticed. Mrs. Washington passed away peacefully last year, General Hayes continued, but not before making me promise that I would always look after the woman who gave her those precious final years with her family. Jackson looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His friends remained at attention, clearly wishing they had never been part of the cruel display that had led to this moment. Now, the general said, turning back to Jackson, you have a choice to make. You can apologize sincerely to Ms. Martinez and hope that she finds it in her heart to forgive you, or you can continue to stand there looking like a fool who doesn't understand the gravity of what he has done. Jackson immediately stepped forward, his face flushed with shame. Ms. Martinez, I am deeply sorry for what I said. There is no excuse for my behavior. I was wrong, and I am truly ashamed of myself. Sarah looked at the young trainee for a long moment. She could see genuine remorse in his eyes, mixed with the fear of someone who knew his military career might be over before it had really begun. Apology accepted, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible in the silent cafeteria. Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is learning from them. General Hayes nodded approvingly at Sarah's response, then turned his attention back to Jackson with a look that suggested the trainee's ordeal was far from over. General Hayes studied Jackson with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent decades evaluating soldiers and their potential. The young trainee stood rigidly at attention, sweat beading on his forehead as he awaited whatever punishment was about to be delivered. Ms. Martinez has shown you more grace and forgiveness than you deserve, the general said firmly. However, her kindness does not absolve you of the consequences of your actions. Report to my office at 800 hours tomorrow morning. Yes, sir, Jackson replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The general then turned to address Jackson's friends, who had remained frozen at their table throughout the entire confrontation. As for the rest of you, your participation in this behavior through your laughter and encouragement makes you complicit. You will all report for additional duty assignments to be determined by your training officers. The young soldiers nodded, quickly, understanding that they had narrowly avoided a much worse fate. Their association with Jackson's cruelty had marked them as well, and they would have to work hard to rebuild their reputations. General Hayes then addressed the entire cafeteria one final time. Let this be a lesson to everyone present. The strength of our military comes not from our ability to tear each other down, but from our capacity to lift each other up. We are all part of the same team, working toward the same goals. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Ms. Martinez represents the very best of what it means to serve others, even as a civilian. She has earned not just my respect, but the respect of everyone on this base. Anyone who fails to treat her with the dignity and courtesy she deserves will answer directly to me. The message was clear and unmistakable. Sarah Martinez was under the general's personal protection, and anyone who crossed her would face serious consequences. As the general prepared to leave, Sarah found her voice. General Hayes, she called softly. Thank you for what you just did, but I don't need special treatment. I just want to do my job and be left alone. The general smiled warmly at her response. Ms. Martinez, what I just did wasn't special treatment. It was simply ensuring that you receive the respect you've already earned. There's a significant difference. He turned back to the cafeteria one last time. I want everyone to understand something important. The scars that Ms. Martinez bears are visible reminders of her sacrifice, but each of us carries invisible scars from our own battles and challenges. We must remember to treat each other with compassion, because we never truly know what someone else has endured. With that, General Hayes nodded respectfully to Sarah and strode out of the cafeteria, leaving behind a room full of people who had just witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Jackson and his friends quietly gathered their belongings and left the cafeteria, their earlier bravado completely replaced by shame and regret. The lesson they had just learned would stay with them throughout their military careers and beyond. As the normal sounds of conversation gradually returned to the cafeteria, Sarah noticed that people were looking at her differently. Instead of the uncomfortable stares or averted gazes she was accustomed to, she saw expressions of respect and admiration. A middle-aged woman from a nearby table approached Sarah hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I just wanted to say that what you did 3 years ago was incredibly brave. I'm sorry that people haven't always treated you with the respect you deserve." Several other people nodded in agreement, and a few others approached to express similar sentiments. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere. The isolation she had experienced since her accident began to lift, replaced by a sense of community and acceptance. Sarah realized that this moment would mark a turning point in her life on the base. She would no longer be just the woman with scars, but Sarah Martinez, the hero who had risked everything to save a stranger. 3 months after the incident in the cafeteria, Sarah's life on the base had transformed completely. Word of her heroic actions had spread throughout the military community, and she found herself receiving invitations to social events, being included in conversations and treated with genuine warmth and respect by her colleagues. The change wasn't just external. Sarah began to see herself differently as well. For 3 years, she had allowed her scars to define her, shrinking into the background and accepting isolation as her fate. Now, she walked with renewed confidence, her head held high and her shoulders back. Jackson had indeed reported to General Hayes the morning after the cafeteria incident. The consequences of his actions included a formal reprimand in his military, filed 2 weeks of additional duty, and a mandatory sensitivity training program. More importantly, the general had assigned him to work directly with Sarah's logistics department for 1 month as part of his punishment. Initially, both Sarah and Jackson had been uncomfortable with the arrangement, but it proved to be beneficial for both of them. Jackson was forced to witness Sarah's exceptional work ethic and professional competence firsthand. He saw how she handled complex logistics challenges with ease, how she treated everyone with respect regardless of their rank, and how she went above and beyond to ensure that supplies reached their destinations on time. Working closely with Sarah also gave Jackson insight into the daily challenges she faced. He observed how some people still stared or whispered, though much less frequently than before. He watched her handle these situations with grace and dignity, never responding with anger or bitterness. By the end of his month-long assignment, Jackson had developed genuine respect and admiration for Sarah. On his final day in the logistics department, he approached her desk with a carefully written letter. "Ms. Martinez," he said formally, "I wanted to give you this before I return to my regular training duties." Sarah opened the letter and read Jackson's heartfelt words expressing his gratitude for the lessons he had learned while working with her. He acknowledged that his punishment had actually been a gift, allowing him to understand the difference between seeing someone's appearance and truly seeing who they are as a person. "Thank you, Jackson," Sarah replied with a smile. "I hope you carry these lessons with you throughout your military career. The best leaders are those who learn from their mistakes and grow from them." Jackson nodded seriously. "Yes, ma'am. I promise you that I will never forget what you've taught me about courage, both on that day 3 years ago and during these past few weeks." Meanwhile, General Hayes had kept his promise to Mrs. Washington in other ways as well. He had recommended Sarah for several professional development opportunities, including advanced training courses that would enhance her career prospects. He had also ensured that her heroic actions were formally recognized through military channels. 6 months after the cafeteria incident, Sarah received an invitation to attend a formal ceremony where she would be presented with a civilian award for valor. The ceremony would be attended by high-ranking military officials and would include a formal recognition of her life-saving actions. At the ceremony, General Hayes spoke about Sarah's courage and sacrifice, ensuring that her story would become part of the base's official history. He read a letter from Mrs. Washington's family, expressing their eternal gratitude to the woman who had given them precious additional years with their beloved grandmother. Sarah accepted the award with humility and grace, using her speech to encourage others to look beyond surface appearances and to remember that true strength comes from our willingness to serve others, regardless of the personal cost. After the ceremony, as Sarah was walking back to her car, she encountered a young female soldier who had been in the audience. The soldier was clearly nervous but determined to speak with her. "Ms. Martinez," the young woman said, "I wanted to thank you for sharing your story. I've been struggling with some scars of my own, not physical ones, but emotional scars from my deployment overseas. Hearing about your courage and how you've overcome the challenges you've faced gives me hope that I can overcome mine too." Sarah smiled warmly and spent several minutes talking with the soldier, sharing some of the strategies that had helped her through her own difficult times. As she drove home that evening, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that difficult day in the cafeteria. She realized that her scars would always be part of her story, but they no longer defined her entire narrative. Instead, they had become symbols of her strength, courage, and willingness to sacrifice for others. Most importantly, she had learned that true beauty comes not from having a perfect appearance, but from having the courage to do what is right, even when it costs us everything.